So I think, are you going to wait?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Yes. I am, according to my best information, I am live right now. If you are out there, please just send me something in the chat to let me know that this is actually working. This is the first time I'm doing it. Oh, yes. Hi, Douglas. Thank you very much. I'm glad that we got this far. We did a sound check a few minutes ago and opened the link, and then it was impossible to open the link again. So we are had to improvise, punt at the last minute, get a new link, try to send it out as fast as possible, and still maintain some composure in order to, say intelligent things in a way that will be engaging and informative and fun. So I will probably edit everything that I've set up to now out of the final video. So I'm going to give myself 1 second so I can find this point before the video begins for real. Hello and welcome. My name is William Hobbs. I am the founder and music director of Chamber Music, etc. It's a great pleasure for me to be here this evening with all of you on the very first live stream that I'm doing and that Chamber Music, etc. is doing. This is in preparation for a concert called the Virtuoso, which I will be giving later on this week. And I will be live streaming that as well. And I'm assuming that we won't have the same technical problems. One funny thing about doing this process, being live on YouTube, and then knowing that everything that I say will be recorded and will be available on the internet for all time, is a bit intimidating. And one way that I'm looking at this evening is for me to practice speaking like this and to give myself something that I can look back in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and be happy that that I have done a good job. And one thing that I think is important to talk about right off the bat is where we are right now in the world. And obviously, we all know that there's been a terrible disease which has taken the lives of 100,000 people in this country alone. And many of those 100,000 people have been vulnerable parts of the population, specifically elderly people and minorities. And at the same time, there's been, as we know, there's been a lot of violence, and it's the cause or the root cause of the violence that we're seeing in our cities right now is violence perpetrated by a police officer on a black man. And it's very important for me to acknowledge that even though as artists we like to feel that we have comforts to bring to the world and that because of what we do, we have a way to bring some solace to people who are in pain. And it's also important to remember that no man is an island, and that we don't operate in a vacuum, even if all the music that I'll be playing later on this weekend is by white men who are dead, that we're still operating in the community that we live in. And there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering, and it's important for us all to acknowledge that we are part of the community that is suffering, and to do whatever we can to try to make it better. And in light of this, a number of music organizations and arts organizations have declared tomorrow, which is the 2nd of June, 2020, a blackout day. The hashtag is "the show must be paused." And the purpose of the blackout day is to provide us all a moment of silence, a moment of reflection, to think about what's happening and what we could do to ensure that what happens next is positive. And in solidarity with the show must be paused, also in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, I've decided not to do the performance tomorrow evening as originally scheduled. I'll participate in the blackout day, and I'll do the performance on Friday at the same time, also live streamed instead. I think it's very important for us to show our support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And I hope that when I watch this video again in 10 years or 5 years or 15 years or whenever it is, that I will be able to say that was a really terrible time and it was a very difficult period for all of us. But look where we are now. We're in a better place. And it's okay for a person to be able to, go jogging and to ask somebody in the park to leash their dog, or not be interested in having a lengthy conversation with the police in the middle of the night, and for the repercussions to not be dependent on the color of their skin. And I am, like I said, I'm hopeful. I'm confident that we as a society, we as a human species are capable of doing better, and so many of us want to. And I hope that when I see this video next in several years, that I will be able to say that we have done better. I hope that we will be in a society where there is more justice and there is more unification, and I think that's something that we all hope for. So I will update the Facebook post, and I will send out an email with a new YouTube link for the concert on Friday. I hope you'll be able to join me. In the meantime, another thought that I have had that I would hope would be able to provide a little bit of comfort to those of you who are watching, and especially to the people who are out there really suffering with COVID and really suffering with injustices, that it has, in various forms, it's happened before, and that other people have lived through similar situations and have been able to produce beautiful things and meaningful things in spite of the very difficult situations they found themselves in. Case in point would be Claude Debussy when he wrote the Etudes, which is the first half of the concert that I'm giving on Friday. He wrote the Etudes in 1915, and that was a year after, as of course you know, the year after the First World War broke out. And Debussy was devastated by what he saw going on around him, about how the fabric of society as he had grown up in it, the society that he knew, was falling apart. And he didn't know how to stop it. He didn't know what to do. And so he isolated himself from his home and his family in a property that belonged to his family in the north of France by the coast in Normandy. And he initially, for the beginning of his isolation, was not able to write anything. But he was working on an edition of works by Chopin that he completed, and partially, I think, as an inspiration inspiration from the edition of Chopin that he had finished, he decided that he was going to write some etudes. And one soundbite about Debussy at the end of his life that I think is important just to revisit right now is that in the last few years of his life, he gravitated toward a style which they call in French, they call it the style dépouillé, meaning stripped down. And if you think about some of the well-known Debussy pieces like La Mer or the Suite Bergamasque is also an example, or L'Île Joyeuse for piano, that the textures are often quite opulent. And you hear a lot of beautiful, radiant, wonderfully warm chords, um, very well thought out, carefully orchestrated textures, and music that is relatively easy to listen to. And if you look at some of the, so right around the time that he wrote these etudes, he started a set of 6 sonatas for various combinations. There's a cello sonata for cello and piano. There's a sonata for flute, viola, and harp. And then the violin sonata, violin piano, which is the last piece that Debussy finished before he died. And it's very easy to hear this kind of stripped down feeling in certain moments of these late sonatas, but that's not the case at all with the etudes. So I think it's interesting that somehow music history in some ways likes to be selective about certain aspects of composers' productions for reasons that are not really clear. But if you tune in on Friday, you will hear that these etudes are not in the least bit stripped down. So what I wanted to do is just show you a little bit what I think is interesting with the etudes and go through them one by one to just, so you'll have something to hang on to. I have to say that the later on in Debussy's career one visits him, I'm going to say this, I'm going to probably regret this in 10 years when I look at this video, but I find that the music gets more and more difficult to really get on the first try. I think there are the Clair de Lune, everybody knows. I think Clair de Lune is beautiful the first time you hear it. The piano piece Reverie, most people have heard it, and it's very easy to get it the first time. I sort of like the midpoint of his career was his opera, Pélias et Mélisande, which has the text, and because it's an opera, there's productions, there's lights, there's staging, there's a lot to hang on to. And then as he progressed past that point in his career, it gets a little bit more difficult. And I think for me, the number one weirdest piece written by Debussy is his ballet Jeu. And I have listened to it any number of times. I even played a performance once. I played a celesta in Jeu, and I still don't get it. I mean, I know that because it's a ballet, there's a story, but I think the music is so bizarre that it's very difficult. And the etudes have their moments. Some of the moments are kind of bizarre, I'm not going to lie, but I don't want that to be the first impression. So what I'm doing here today is to just give you enough of like little snapshots of each of the pieces that you will be able to walk away from the performance saying they're not as weird as I thought they were. So quick thing that I just want to talk about before I do that is what etude means. Most of you know that etude is the French word for study, and that every instrument has a repertoire of studies that are devoted to particular technical problems that are native to that instrument. And for the piano literature, we have studies from technical studies written by Mozart, we have technical studies written by Haydn, and then we also have, for example, Bach's Weltern Klavier was published in the Klavierübung, it's called, which means piano study. So it was from a huge series of books of pieces that were designed to be studies. And Bach is a great example, the Bach's contribution of pieces that you learn a lot by working on them, and you grow a lot as a technician and as a musician from playing them, but they are conceived as studies. And after around the time of Beethoven, a little bit after Beethoven, when the piano really started to come into its own as an instrument, there were a number of books of studies that were published, and some of them were more interesting than others. I'm going to show you some examples in just a second, but the important thing to remember is that the tradition has been with us the whole time, and if we go for Bach as a precedent, then the idea was that the pieces would be very interesting, but you would also learn a lot as a performer from playing them. And then when the sort of music became, I guess, musical study became more available to the middle class in particular, so it's a little bit more commercial, then there were hundreds of books of studies published. And the two names that I need to single out before we talk about Debussy are three names. The first one is Czerny, who was a very, very fine composer, but was excellent at writing studies, and he wrote thousands of studies, and they're very, very good. They're really very useful. I've played a number of them in my own time, and I've learned a lot from them. I would continue to use them. I recommend them to my students. They're not necessarily the most compelling music, but some of them are very charming. He was quite a good composer. And the other name that I just need to mention tonight is Hanon. I hesitate to use that word because anyone who has grown up playing Hanon exercises will know why. I think it's funny that in the preface to the Virtuoso Pianist, which is Hanon's book, that he recommends them particularly, the studies recommends them particularly to young ladies in boarding schools, because I can say from my own experience that they are not suitable for people to practice in their living room for hours on end when there are people listening. Just keep that in mind. And so then after the early part of the 18th century, there were a number of other names. There were Kramer, Moscheles, Clementi wrote studies. And then in 1823, Chopin arrived with his first book of studies and blew everyone out of the water. And Chopin, which I think is kind of amazing at the time, was 23 when he published his first set. And he was 27 when he published his second set. And the sophistication of the piano writing is really remarkable. The particular interest of the books of studies is that not only do they function as excellent technical exercises, which everyone must learn, they also are very interesting pieces, and they work really well on the concert platform. So after Chopin came Liszt, and Liszt wrote a few books of studies, not quite as many as Czerny. And the interesting thing about Liszt's studies is that they become not about particular technical problems per se. They become vast soundscapes for the piano, all of which are difficult. So then under Liszt, the study becomes an opportunity for the composer to write really hard pieces. And that tradition continued through the rest of the 19th century, through Scriabin, through Rachmaninoff, through Godowsky, and then ended up in Debussy's lap around the time of the First World War, which I think is interesting. I think it's interesting that in a time of extreme political instability and personal duress, Debussy turned to a genre that seems very uncharacteristic of him. And also very interesting that he reached backwards to an extent that was not really seen in most of his work up to that time, to all the way back to the French harpsichordists at the end of the 18th century, specifically Couperin, who wrote a book about playing the harpsichord, which has a few very interesting studies, and also to Chopin. So Debussy, I think, is a tribute to Chopin. He wrote his set of 12 etudes. Chopin's sets are both 12 etudes. And each of Debussy's etudes concerns a particular technical problem, which is the same for Chopin's etudes. And what I think Debussy took from Liszt or from Rachmaninoff or from other composers like that who wrote etudes before him, is that the pieces function perfectly well as soundscapes, but they're built around a technical problem the way that Chopin's are. So it's not necessarily noticeable what the purpose of the etude would be for us, a student. It's also, in some cases, I think the real challenge, what the real part of the study is for many of the etudes that Debussy wrote, is getting them across to the audience. And why I say that is that some of them are easier to get into, like I said before, than others of them. In some cases, the juncture of what's happening from one moment to the next it's really not clear how the transitions happen, and it's not really clear where he's going. So in a lot of the situation, a lot of the time, you feel like you can't predict what's happening next. And when I talk about Rachmaninoff in a few minutes, I will go on about form a little bit, but form is very important to me. And I think an issue that I've had working on these pieces, these Debussy etudes, is that in a lot of cases, the form is just not there. And sometimes there's like a reference to a particular form that we recognize, or there's some kind of repetition of gestures that happens frequently enough that we feel like there's a form. And in other cases, it's just not there. And I have come to the conclusion that what Debussy is doing in these situations is really forcing us to listen in the moment and not have any kind of attachment to what might have just happened or what is about to happen, and really just focusing on what the here and now is, which is a very interesting, for me, is a very Eastern concept. And it's around that time that some of the the Eastern philosophy from China and Japan started to filter into Western Europe, and I think that we have a better understanding of it now. But certain fundamental concepts that really resounded with Debussy, and that was one of them. And so, for Debussy, the form of a piece was significantly less important than the beauty of each moment as it passed, and that is really a staple. It's a real feature of these etudes. And it's interesting that that became the norm during the 50s and 60s. It was no longer cool for there to be a discernible form. And it was really moment to moment composition, moment to moment listening, and is a bit of an oversimplification, but I'm just going to say that the major composer of the 20th century who started that trend was Debussy. That's what I have to say in general. Let's just go over them in detail. Let me move this. The first one is called Five Fingers After Mr. Czerny, and it starts out like this. And any pianist in the world who has grown up studying Czerny will recognize that. So the very first etude from the School of Velocity sounds like this. Okay, I'll stop. So, but we know that that's Czerny, and so he is riffing on that in a very affectionate way, because we see the kid, or we hear the kid doing his Czerny and just being a little bit mischievous. He gets in trouble, so he does it again. And then he's a little mischievous again. And then he starts to get into it. And goes into his own world. And then it comes back, and then he goes into his own world again. And then you hear this interplay of Czerny and the kid in his own world, which is Debussy. And one thing that I forgot to mention is that there is a little bit of a Hanon quote toward the end, toward the very beginning of the piece, which sounds like this. Which sounds like this. I just had a flashback for every time I played that gesture. And but you know, it's not meant to be. It's not meant to be rude. It's meant to be affectionate. And the first one is such a friendly opener for the set, and you really get to enjoy hearing the fantasy. You get to enjoy hearing the childhood, and it's really a wonderful piece. Um, the second piece is called Thirds, and Chopin's exercise in thirds is something that we all have suffered through in our time, like that. And Debussy's is slower rather than fast. And so on. And it's, you know, Chopin's is so difficult. We learn so much from it, but it's really one color from beginning to end. And Debussy's visits so many places in about the same amount of time. It's fascinating. The third piece in this set is called For Fourths, and there is no precedent for that in the etude literature that I know, because there was no allowance for parallel fourths in the Western classical tradition. So what it would sound like if we play the Dies Irae, which we'll come back to later. I introduced that on purpose. If we played sort of Gregorian chant style, like that, that's parallel fourths. And after the musical tradition as we know it, after the harmonic language really became codified, that was no longer allowed. So Debussy's piece is, in some ways, a new departure. And so on. And one thing that I read when I was researching this to make this presentation was that this piece manages to avoid chinoiserie, they call it, you know, because the Chinese influence was huge in French culture at this time, and it's very easy to think about using those particular intervals in a way that sounds stereotypically Asian, and Debussy doesn't do it. It's fascinating what he's managed to accomplish. So after the etudes in thirds, the etudes in fourths, there's an etudes in sixths, and Chopin's etudes in sixths. Again, we've all suffered through this in our time. This is not going to be very good, but it goes like this, like that. And what is so difficult about sixths is because the interval is rather wide. It's very difficult for it not to be awkward. And Chopin's etude in sixth is incredibly awkward. Debussy starts in the very same part of the keyboard as Chopin's, and then he just goes in a completely different direction. But that's not the direction he goes in. It actually goes like this. So it's slow rather than fast, and it meanders rather than being focused on one idea. I think of the first four, it's the most challenging to listen to, and I think it's intentional that after the most challenging one comes one of the most user-friendly ones, which is number 5, the etude in octaves. After the thirds, the fourths, the sixths, there's the octaves, and Chopin's etudes in octaves, you will remember, goes like this, like that. So it's just sneaking from one key to the other, like that. And Debussy's etude in octaves is instead all about jumping. So it's like, that. And I missed about half of it just now because I was trying to demonstrate. But the challenge of crawling the way Chopin's etude is versus jumping the way that Debussy's etude, it's actually like an order of magnitude more difficult, which is not anyone's problem but the performers. But it's, I guess it's a problem. And it's the way that the material repeats, the way that the material I think is very easy to access is, like I said before, it's deliberate because number 4 is kind of hard not to sit through, but it's kind of hard to grasp. And number 5 is very user friendly. Number 6 is called for the 8 fingers, and he means these. I called it in my program. I called it no thumbs allowed, and it's one of the most awkward pieces I know. And I think that he had in mind, he had Chopin's Black Key Etude, like that one, which is not that awkward and is really fun to play. But so he's really using a lot of black keys. And really just using these 4 fingers. It's really fun to listen to. It's kind of amazing what it sounds like, but it's hard. And then we are in number 7. Number 7 is called Chromatic Scale Degrees, and obviously, for those of you who are pianists, you know it's just going from one black key to the white key next, just one key to the next one. And why they're difficult is because, as any pianist will tell you, the white keys are at one level, the black keys are at another level, and depending on how you negotiate or how you write the passage work, sometimes your hand is squunched up in these tiny patterns, and sometimes, like, your thumb is on a black key while your other fingers are on white keys. Sometimes it's reversed. Sometimes the distances change, and it's also extremely awkward. But it's a good piece, and when just to help you listen to it, you know, because just listening to a lot of notes is maybe not that compelling for a lot of people, but this one has a tune, and this one has a tune that comes back. And so that one just comes back at regular intervals, and at least it gives you something to reference as we're going through thousands of notes. Number 8 is called for Ornamentation, and that one is interesting because, as we know, the example that I like to use when I teach about ornamentation to singers is don't judge me, Unchained Melody by the Righteous Brothers, because if you listen to the song, if you look on in a pick book, the tune just sounds like this. But then if you listen to what the guy does in the performance, everything that he does to decorate that tune is an ornament. And most of them have names, and for people who've grown up with the song and have like a strong emotional tie to the song, it's really because of the ornaments that the performance is so effective. Now, the corollary to that is that there's a basic tune, and then there's a whole lot of things that happen to the tune which qualifies ornaments, which if you listen to that song back to back with what I just did, you can hear exactly what I'm talking about. The interesting facet about Debussy's Etude for Ornaments is that there's really not much of a tune. It's really a lot of ornaments. So it's really more texture than it is a tune being embellished. It visits a lot of places, that particular one, and just as I feel, in my personal opinion, that number 4 was the most challenging of the first 4, I think number 8 is the most challenging for the listener of the second 4. And part of that is because there's so much on the surface, and there's not really that much melody. There are ideas that happen once, there are ideas that happen twice, there are ideas that happen frequently, and some never come back. And it's yes. Okay. Number 9 is called for repeated notes, and that is one particular very difficult challenge in playing the piano is if you're repeating a note to make it speak the requisite number of times. The piano has an advantage over other keyboard instruments. I'm thinking particularly of the harpsichord or the organ. The piano has the advantage. It's called the escapement, double escapement, and it allows the hammer to strike the string, but then not come all the way back down, only halfway. So it doesn't require as much energy to get the key strike to happen again really quickly. There's a very limited amount of repertoire for the harpsichord involving fast repeated notes. Most of them, the famous pieces, are by Scarlatti, who wrote them for a particular person who either really enjoyed working on repeated notes or was really good at them. So Debussy's Etude doesn't have a lot of precedences, and it is to compound the challenge of getting all those notes to speak for the entire 3-minute, 4-minute piece. He adds the challenge of having most of it be quiet, which means that trying to get all of the notes to speak in a very exposed texture so the listener can hear if the note doesn't repeat, but quiet is a big challenge. Yes, I was going to say torturous, but I probably shouldn't have said that. The piece is very shadowy. It doesn't have a lot in the way of melody, but it does have very small gestures that you hear over and over again in a bunch of different incarnations. And I think that's what makes it possible to really get it the first time through. I think it's the most user-friendly of the last set of 4 etudes. Number 10, 3 from the end, is called for contrasting sonorities. And what he means is what pianists and piano teachers, we talk about color all the time. And even though the mechanism of the piano, it's just you push a key, a hammer strikes a string, we believe as pianists that it's possible to attain a wide variety of color depending on how hard you strike the key, how rough you are, how gentle you are, any number of slight modifications to the way we approach the keyboard in order to get different sounds. And that what this particular etude number 10 exploits that and nothing else. It's a lot of texture, and it's a lot of opposing tone colors. Just like in the beginning, he's got this, and then he has this, which requires a different touch based on what he wrote. And then he has this, which is supposed to be short with the pedal. Again, a different touch. And then touch number 2 comes back. Touch number 1 comes back. Touch number 2 comes back. And then touch number 2 morphs into the next section. And so on. It's I think that number 10 is best listened to on the floor under the piano. Most of us will never have that luxury. But it is remarkable that even though the mechanism doesn't change based on what we're doing, it is possible to achieve a wide variety of color, and number 10 exploits that. The last one, the second to last one, and number 11 is called it's called composed arpeggios, and what he means is arpeggios that cover more than one octave. So, for example, here's an arpeggio that covers one octave. That would be an arpeggio that covers more than one octave. That would be a composed arpeggio. And so what that means is that most of the structures in number 11 are very wide physically on the keyboard. I think the clear precedent for number 11 is Chopin's Opus 25, number 1. It sounds like this. Sounds like this. And which which exploits the piano's natural resonance with the pedal down and a certain amount of wideness over the gestures that he uses. So Debussy expands them. Chopin's tends to be more restricted because he's after a particular sound effect, and there's a melody. And Debussy's version is really all about texture. So like, there's a little bit of a melody. And then most of it is really color. But number 11, I think it sounds the most, for most of us, it sounds the most like the Debussy that we know and love. And in my opinion, no, not in my opinion, I know for a fact that it's one of the etudes that is played the most often. Which brings us to number 12. And number 12 is called Four Chords. And you would think that it would be, we all know that Debussy loved his chords. So like, here's a quote from Péléas and Maison. That he loved that sonority and that he loved to use chords. Just like that. Just a chord would be the what we call parallel motion, and the chords is what keeps the music going. For him, that's the essence of the music. This piece does not do that. So this is another piece like, if you remember, I talked about number 5, the octave one. This one's all about jumping, and these jumps are crazy. So what it happens, we have this like that, and you see that the jumps happen in different directions. Sorry, I had to look. And that they're not the same distance. So like the left hand has to go this far, right hand only has to go this far, and then the chords keep changing. So we have to keep looking for the next jump. And there is, I think, the precedent for number 12 is really the end of the second movement of the Schumann Fantasy, which I played back in December, and I'm not going to. It really needs a little bit more practice than I'm not going to show you how it goes. But it's the same principle. It's these jumps that happen really fast in different directions, but not the same distance. So like sometimes the left hand goes further than the right hand, sometimes the right hand goes further than the left hand. And because it's immediately obvious when you miss one, it's incredibly stressful to play. And so Debussy's Etude number 12 is exactly the same. Again, not anyone's problem but the performers, but I just feel like throwing it out there because it's very present in my mind how hard number 12 is. And number 12 has a middle section which is very slow and exploits the idea of chords in a way that sounds a little bit more like the Debussy that we're used to. That's a sonority we've heard before. That's the wrong one, sorry. And now I'm having memory slip because I'm live. Something like that. That's the sonority. And that's the Debussy sonorities that we recognize from earlier in his career. And but you see him facing toward the future in the middle part of number 12 because it's very fragmented. And there are huge moments of silence, more silence in the middle section of number 12 than any other piece of Debussy's that I know, and certainly more than any of the other etudes. Which also I'm just mentioning because as he became very influential in the avant-garde movement of the 50s and 60s, so did the idea of having huge amounts of silence inside a piece become a huge part of the avant-garde as well. And somebody out there is going to say it wasn't Debussy, it was Webern. I know it was Webern, but it's interesting that Debussy thought of it first. Okay. Let's talk about Rachmaninoff. And what I would like to say first is I love Rachmaninoff. I think he is a master, underrated master of composition. And besides being one of the top 10 best pianists in his own right of the 20th century, he's a fabulous, fabulous composer. I enjoy the challenge of learning a new Rachmaninoff piece I love the orchestral textures. I love the hyper emotionality, and I love the endless challenge. But it's very, very satisfying music to play. I'm bringing this up because I just want to share that this concert began life as a set of, it was going to be a concert of etudes. And I had this idea that I was going to learn the Debussy etudes once and for all, and that I wanted to find other sets that were written around the same time. Turned out that Rachmaninoff wrote his Opus 39 set of Etude Tableau in 1916 to 1917, right before he left Russia. It was the last piece that he wrote before he left Russia, which was in 1917, speaking of political instability. And also, Bartók wrote his three etudes around that same time, too, around 1918. And also, Bartók was in Hungary. He was about to leave for good, and Hungary was a mess during the war. Russia was a mess. France was a mess. And I thought it was very interesting, that these three composers turned to the genre of the etude, which seems so kind of uh, arbitrary in a way, um, to put their musical feelings in during a period of war. And I think it's also interesting that those three sets were written around the same time, and you can really hear the sensibilities of the three composers. You can hear their own evolving relationship to modernism in each of the three sets. The Rachmaninoff are on the direction of being more modern than many of his early pieces, which are more famous, and Bartók are crazy. Really, really, some of his craziest music. And I thought it was a great idea. And as I was working on the program, I just started to feel more and more like maybe for a few people, it's very compelling to watch somebody play 24 really hard pieces in a row. But for most people, it's not as interesting as it maybe is for pianists. So I started to think, what am I missing in this concert? And what I realized that I was missing was tunes, really memorable tunes. So I switched out the Rachmaninoff Etude Tableau for the Rachmaninoff First Sonata, which I had started working on in undergrad a couple of years ago, and never quite got around to completing, um, for various reasons. One of them being that it's really hard, and another one being that it's really long, and the third one being something that I'm going to share in a little bit. It's really specific to the last movement. And I found that coming back to it after all these years, it's even better than I remember it, and even more of a masterpiece than I realized when I was younger. And I am aware, as many of you are also, that Rachmaninoff wrote two piano sonatas, this one and you guessed it, Sonata Number Two. And Sonata Number Two is the one that gets played the most. It gets, I mean, they're both real undertakings for the performers, so they don't get played as much as your average Beethoven sonata. But of the two, Number Two gets by far the most airtime. And I've always thought maybe it's because there's something wrong with Sonata Number One, that maybe it's not as interesting, or it's not as good, or there's just some reason why people don't like it. And I when I picked it up again, I thought the reason why people don't like it is because it's so difficult. And then I started looking at Sonata Number Two, getting ready for this performance. And Sonata Number Two, it's a little bit easier, but it's not easy. It's not that much easier. It's a little bit shorter. It's quite a bit shorter, actually, but it's not that much shorter. And it doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't have the same degree of real memorable tunes that the first sonata has. So I'm thinking that the answer must lie elsewhere, why it's not as popular. And just go with me here. I think that what I've come to the conclusion is that the reason why Sonata Number Two is so stereotypically Russian. It's just this huge emotional outpouring from beginning to end. It starts loud. It has this huge ending. There's these really tender moments of intense emotional lyricism. It's got a little bit of everything. But Sonata number one, I think, is more classical with a capital C in its composition. And I think it's for people who are looking for Russian music with a capital R that can actually be a little bit of a turnoff, weirdly. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean. The first movement, there are three movements in the first Rachmaninoff piano sonata. It's in D minor, as we all know. And important precedent for a piece called a sonata in sonata form that's in D minor is, of course, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. If you just ask Bruckner, nobody can escape Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Ask Mahler, no one can escape Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And Rachmaninoff's sonata, the very first theme of the first movement is this. In other words, there's very spooky, quiet, open fifths. And then there's really loud, strong, assertive chordal textures. And that is, for me, I think it's a deliberate reference to the opening of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which I happen to have right here, which starts like this, as we all remember, of course. Just like Rachmaninoff, it goes on for a little bit longer, but then when the opening tune of Beethoven 9 comes in, and so on, we hear it's exactly the same sort of juxtaposition of gestures that Rachmaninoff uses. And I don't think that Rachmaninoff intended to send the message, I'm writing the new Beethoven Ninth Symphony. I think it was really like Debussy, making an affectionate reference to Czerny in his first etude. I think he's just saying, I am going to present a piece that is a little bit more stereotypically Germanic than one might expect from a Russian composer. And another way that manifests itself, just take a listen to this again. So we have a perfect fifth, and then a melody, which is just this, a second, one key to the next. And then the second theme of the first movement sounds like this. Which is it's just a second. So the whole melody is constructed on seconds. And the closing theme of the first movement sounds like this. Sorry, it doesn't sound like that. So what we're hearing is we're hearing seconds and then a fifth. So basically, all the melodic material in the whole first movement is either based on a fifth or a second. And it's kind of amazing. That's a process that I associate a lot with Schumann. If you think about the Kreisleriana, for example, that all of the melodic material in the Kreisleriana, it's based on particular intervals. It's like a second or third or fourth, and mostly seconds and thirds. And it's fascinating to think about a composer constructing an entire piece on such a limited palette. But for me, that's something that Bach would do, Haydn would do, Beethoven would do, Brahms would do. That says I really associate that with German composers, and I think Rachmaninoff was just aligning himself with that particular part of the tradition with this sonata. And that, coupled with the fact that it's very long and it's very difficult, I think it makes it perhaps less appealing than number two for certain personalities. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. We're not going to bash Rachmaninoff's First Piano Sonata because it's really, really wonderful. And The first movement, I just presented all the material. It just goes on from there. The form is relatively, I mean, it's very classical. It's a very classical sonata form. There's the first theme, very clear contrasting second theme, a closing theme announcing that it's time for the adventure of the development to begin. The development section exploits a little bit of the first theme, a little bit of the closing theme. We have over that repeated in many guises during the first part of the development section. And then at the climax of the development section, the second theme comes back. And I'm just going to say that for Friday, just give you something to listen for. And then, especially amazing, which I do want you to listen for on Friday when I play it, is the second theme comes back in the climax of the whole of the development section, for me, like climax of the whole movement. And then it gradually morphs in a really remarkable way into the first theme. It's actually extraordinary the way that he handled it. There's so much control over the transition back into the recapitulation. It's excellent, really very stunning. The other thing that we just need to watch out for is at the end of the first movement, there's another big climax, and when that big climax happens, he presents this theme, which again you can just see is a fifth, a second, and another fifth. The same intervals that we've been using the whole time. It happens to be the main theme for the second movement. And when it comes back after all of the noise that the first movement has abated, the second movement comes and the theme sounds like this. And so on. You have to come to Friday's performance to hear it all. But what I have always been sort of fascinated by with the second movement is that everything in it, literally everything, is constructed around this fifth or second. There's this very important motive at the beginning of the second movement, which comes back. That's just a sequence of fifths. We heard that the accompaniment sounds like this. This is the fifth, obviously. And there's another fifth on top, which was related to the original fifth by a second. So, like that, you hear the second and the fifth, and it really, the more you look for that, the more you find it in the second movement. It's really extraordinary, especially because you would think, and I have to say, many years ago, when I looked at the sonata the first time, I did think that it was so constructed to a point that there was no actual tune. I mean, that's not exactly the right word to use, but there was no. For me, it was hard to find a through line. It was really hard to feel, was what I really mean. It was hard to feel the soul of the movement because it was hard not to see, oh, there's another second. You know, there's that motive again. There's that fifth again. And it's a real challenge, you know, to be aware of the details and not lose the heart that needs to be there. Reminds me a lot as I'm practicing and thinking about so many strange things when I'm practicing. It reminds me of the cathedral in Chartres that if you really know how they built that cathedral, how the architecture is designed, it's pretty incredible that there's so many very minute numerical relations between different parts of the cathedral and proportions that are based on not based on necessarily how the building would look, but on certain numerical relationships. And if you start to look for them, then you can find them. And maybe you get to the point where all you see is the detail and you see how it's constructed and you don't get the whole picture. And that's what, when I come back to the second movement, sorry, that I really noticed that's what it needs more than anything. Just a beautiful song. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous movement with a remarkable amount of very finely constructed detail. And then there's the third movement. So the thing that I wanted to not say before that I'm going to say now, one challenge that I had learning this piece all those years ago, the first time, was I didn't think the third movement was that strong. I found that, well, I don't need to tell you why I didn't think it was that strong. I just didn't. And I discovered this time around that it doesn't really work until you play it fast, and then it really works. And it's impossible to sight read up to tempo. It really takes a long time to get it into your fingers to a point where you can render it up to tempo, up to speed. But then it's pretty incredible. Just so you know what to listen for, the main tune of the third movement is, as silly as it sounds, is couched in some craziness. Like that. And as the movement progresses, it gets even more and more kind of wild, the way that it's written. And again, that's just our seconds. They're seconds that we've been seeing from the beginning of the sonata. And for me, the third movement is in a modified, just to be geeky, a modified sonata rondo form. And what the modification is that normally for sonata rondo, you had A, B, A, development, A, B. And what Rachmaninoff does in this movement is he compresses the middle three sections, the A, the development, and the A return, the A and the development, into one. So instead of there being 7 sections, there are 5. The B section is going to point to something very interesting, which is, this is how it starts. And so on. So this is real like march feel. And again, it's just a second. And another second. And another second. It's just the same interval. Again, we've been seeing it the whole time. It's just that when the first theme of this movement goes up, the second one goes down. Like that. And so that's very interesting to me. I don't know if anyone will agree, but I think it's cool. And the second movement also, the second theme, the second section of this rondo has a little marchy section that comes in. Let me just find my bearings. Kind of this like cool, spooky march feel. And then we get something, the final, like the sort of last hurrah of the B section sounds like this. Like that, which sounds like a lot to me like the last movement of the Second Symphony, which, by the way, was Opus 27. This piano sonata is Opus 28. No wonder there's resemblance. But it gets crazier and crazier and crazier, and then when we get to time for the B section to end, time for the development to start, there's a big crash. You can't miss it. And wait till Friday. And then there's a motto. I forgot to mention this. This happens toward the beginning of the first movement. This is the motto that happens. It returns several times over the course of the first movement, also in the third movement, just as a way to give us all a break before the next craziness happens. There's an interesting passage that occurs 3 times in the middle section, 2 times in the middle section, 1 time in the final section. Kind of sounds like this. And if you've been paying attention attention, you will recognize the, it's our second, it's our original theme from the beginning of the movement. It's just in a completely different texture now. And there's a tune on top of it, which has a third. It's not all seconds or fifths, but it's like the tune of the second movement, only it's altered. So like that, which is cool. Again, so well constructed, but the way that he shapes it with the harmonies and the piano texture, it just doesn't feel like it's constructed. It feels really heartfelt. And then the development section continues. There's these sort of calm moments. There's some crazy stuff that sounds more like the second theme, something like that. It gets a little bit like relentless and scary. And where it ends is where, drum roll please, there's a quote of the Dies Irae at the very end of the development section. Like that. And then we realized that most of the material has been fragments of this tune that fragments of that tune that he has taken apart, done things to, turn them upside down, put two of them together, all kinds of things. But that is actually the basis of the melodic material for the third movement. And at the time, I knew that Rachmaninoff was really into the Dies Irae theme. It's very popular. A lot of composers like it. All over the Berlioz Symphony Fantastique, for example, Liszt, Totentanz makes a big use of it. And it's, when we think of Gregorian chant, if we think Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the Dies Irae is the tune that they use. And so I thought, all those years ago, you know, come on, Rachmaninoff, don't do the Dies Irae again. And now that I'm a little bit more mature, I realized that it was just, for whatever reason, it was very important to him at that time, so I can't judge that. But also the way that he used it as the basis for pretty much the entire piece. Now, like, come on, that's pretty remarkable. It really is. And so we finally get our Dies Irae really only once, really big and loud. And then the A music starts again. We get the recapitulation of the A section. We get a recapitulation of the B section. And then we get the coda. And then the Dies Irae comes out to play a lot in the coda. And I will leave that for Friday so that you can just listen for the Dies Irae. Like on the last two pages, I would say there's, especially the last, not the very last page, but the second to last page, third to last page, there's like Dies Irae everywhere. And it's like the second movement, you know, there's sort of this one little gesture which generates the entire movement. And so then it's like the Dies Irae really permeates the end of the sonata. And then there's a surprise visit from the second theme of the first movement right toward the end. And then everything ends in maximum drama. It's a good time. And I think that it's important to recognize that the first movement beautifully never mind, let me try that again. First movement, beautifully well constructed, really shows a very sophisticated attention to musical architecture and a willingness at least to exploit some aspects of the German tradition in a way that might be a little bit novel for Russian music. Second movement is beautiful, heartfelt, very constructed, obviously, as I said before, but beautifully, very, very, very touching. And then the third movement doesn't have a lot of emotion. I mean, and it doesn't have a lot of contrast, doesn't have the same depth, I would say. And I think that I actually think it's deliberate. I think that it's the same thing. Actually, in the second piano sonata, the last movement is the least emotionally varied. The second symphony is the same thing. The Third Symphony is the same thing, and actually, only really of all his big multi-movement cello sonatas, the same thing. That of all the multi-movement pieces of his, I would say that it's really the standout of the last movement being as emotionally um, varied as the other movements is the second piano concerto, and that's because of the big tune that he incorporates. But I think he was at the height of his powers when he wrote this sonata. If he wanted to do that again, he could have done it for this sonata. He just chose not to. He chose not to for the Second Symphony. I think we get so caught up in the hyper emotionality of the lyricism with Rachmaninoff. Sometimes it's easy to get mad at him if he doesn't give us the same kind of big, passionate, tender, juicy, sexy music. But the last movement of the sonata accomplishes something slightly different, and I think it accomplishes it in an extraordinarily successful way. And that's the Rachmaninoff's first piano sonata. The Encore, I will tell you in 30 seconds, and then we will be wrapping up for tonight. The Encore will be Rachmaninoff's transcription or paraphrase, is probably more accurate, of Tchaikovsky's Lullaby. And it was the Lullaby, the original Tchaikovsky, it's a song, and it has the most remarkable, kind of unforgettable, I will say, combination of tenderness of a mother, just to be stereotypical, could be a father, but tenderness for a parent, shall we say, toward a child, um, trying to sing the child to sleep with one of the saddest tunes I have ever heard. And Tchaikovsky was really good at writing sad music, as we all know. And this is one of his very saddest tunes. And I thought that it maybe would be appropriate because the text of the original song, it's just go to sleep, baby, have sweet dreams. I've called on the wind and the sun and an eagle to watch over you. And the eagle flew away, the sun set behind the sea, and the wind stayed with the child for 3 days and then went back to its own mom. And Wind's mom asked where he'd been, if he'd been, rustling the surface of the sea, or if he'd been blowing flowers, or what he was up to. And the wind said, "No, I was with a baby. I was just rocking a baby." And it's the sweetest text. And I thought that besides the fact that it was the last piece that Rachmaninoff finished, this paraphrase of this song, it was the last piece that Rachmaninoff wrote. It's kind of an interesting correspondence with Etudes being Debussy's last big hurrah for the piano. It's also in these very difficult times, it's nice to, or I think nice is not at all the right word, but I would say important to acknowledge the pain of what we're going through and to acknowledge the sadness that many of us feel, but also to have there be an element of comfort for the child and all of us that is feeling so much sadness and so much pain. And I think the combination of comfort and sadness is unlike any other piece that I know. And so it seemed like a good choice. And I hope that on Friday you will agree. Thank you so much for listening. I would love to hear your feedback. This is my first time doing this, and I will keep doing this for future concerts, and hopefully won't have so many technical problems. And we'll continue organizing my thoughts even better. Everybody, please stay safe. Please stay well. Please join me on Friday if you are able. And we'll look forward to being in a better place in a few months or a year or sometime soon.